The Ink Beneath the City. An urban fantasy novella. Chapter 1. The Rain and the Wolves, 1,500 words. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days, and Chicago was drowning in it. Streets slick with water, gutters overflowing, the air thick with the smell of wet concrete and rust. Nora Kane stood under the sagging awning of a shuttered bodega on West Division Street, her leather jacket heavy with damp, her boots tapping a restless rhythm against the cracked sidewalk. She wasn't waiting for anyone, just watching. Across the street, a street lamp flickered, its light splintering through the downpour, casting jagged shadows over the alley where the mural lived. It wasn't just any mural. Painted on the side of a crumbling brick warehouse, it was a wild, chaotic swirl of wolves with amber eyes, ravens with outstretched wings, and skeletal hands clawing up from a river of ink-black water. To the average passerby, it was graffiti, some artsy kid's late-night rebellion. But Nora knew better. She'd seen it move, seen the paint ripple like it was alive. She'd been watching it for weeks, ever since the leak started. Tonight, it was still, the colors glistening under the rain like they were holding their breath. She fished a cigarette from her pocket, lit it with a flick of her Zippo, and let the flame briefly illuminate the scar that ran from her left eyebrow to her jaw. A jagged line etched into her skin 5 years ago, when she'd first stumbled into Chicago's hidden world. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, insistent and ignored. Probably her sister, Lena, asking why she'd missed dinner again. Family didn't understand. They didn't see the things she did. A low growl rolled out of the alley, cutting through the patter of rain. Nora's hand slid to the iron knife tucked into a belt, its handle worn smooth from years of use. She exhaled a plume of smoke and squinted through the haze. The mural was shifting, subtle at first, a trick of the light. Then the wolves' heads turned, their painted eyes flaring a dull amber, and the skeletal hands stretched outward, peeling free of the wall with a sound like tearing paper. "Shit," she muttered, flicking the cigarette into a puddle where it hissed and died. Not tonight. The first wolf landed on the pavement with a wet slap, its body a mess of dripping paint that solidified into muscle and fur as it shook itself. A second followed, then a third, until the alley held a snarling pack of 6. They weren't real, not flesh and blood, but that didn't make them less dangerous. Nora had fought their kind before, creatures born from the city's underbelly, a shadow world of magic stitched into Chicago's bones. She'd lost friends to them, lost sleep, lost pieces of herself. She drew the knife, its blade etched with runes that hummed faintly in the damp air, a soft vibration she felt in her bones. The wolves circled, their claws clicking against the pavement, leaving smears of black behind. Behind them, the mural pulsed, the river of ink-black water rippling, as if something bigger was stirring beneath its surface. "Who's pulling your strings?" Nora said, more to herself than the wolves. She'd been tracking these leaks for months, pockets of magic bursting through the city's seams, spilling out rats that whispered in the sewers, crows that spoke with human voices, and now this. It wasn't random chaos. Someone, or something, was tearing at the fabric that kept Chicago's mundane and mystical halves apart, and she was tired of playing cleanup. The lead wolf lunged, jaws snapping at her throat. Nora sidestepped, slashing downward with the knife. The blade sank into its shoulder, and the wolf dissolved into a splash of ink that stained the ground, the smell sharp and metallic. One down. The others didn't hesitate, coming at her in a blur of teeth and claws. She ducked under a swipe, rolled across the wet pavement, and drove the knife into another's flank. It burst apart, splattering her jacket with black. She was on her feet again, breath ragged, as the remaining four closed in. She fought like she always did, sharp, precise, no wasted movement. A slash to the throat took out the third. A dodge and a stab felled the fourth. The fifth caught her arm with its claws, tearing through her sleeve and drawing blood before she buried the knife in its chest. The sixth leaped, and she met it midair, driving the blade up through its jaw. It exploded into ink, drenching her as she hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop against the alley wall. Panting, she wiped the knife on her jeans and stood. Her arm stung, blood mixing with the rain, but she'd had worse. The mural wasn't done, though. The skeletal hands flexed, fingers curling, and a figure began to emerge. A man, or something like one, his skin a shifting canvas of tattoos that writhed like living things. He stepped onto the pavement, 7 feet tall, his eyes 2 burning pinpricks of white. The air around him crackled, smelling of ozone and old paper. "Nora Kane," he said, his voice a deep rasp that echoed inside her skull, bypassing her ears entirely. "You're persistent." She tightened her grip on the knife, ignoring the ache in her arm. "You know me? That's cute. Who the hell are you?" He smiled, revealing teeth like shards of glass. "Call me the Scribe. I write what's hidden. I bring it forth." "You're the one cracking the city open," she said, pieces slotting together. The leaks, the creatures, the way the magic felt like it was bleeding out of something ancient and buried. "Why?" "The city's a cage," he said, spreading his arms. The tattoos on his skin flared, dragons coiling, serpents slithering, eyes that blinked and stared at her. Built on bones and blood, sealed with lies. "I'm just setting it free." Nora didn't have time for cryptic bullshit. She charged, aiming the knife for his chest. He caught her wrist mid-strike, his grip cold and unyielding, like iron wrapped in ice. The runes on the blade flared, burning his hand with a hiss of steam, and he snarled, releasing her. She stumbled back, but he was already moving, his tattoos peeling off his skin like living weapons. A dragon snapped at her leg, teeth grazing her boot. A serpent coiled around her arm, squeezing until she felt her bones creak. She slashed wildly, cutting through them, ink splattering the walls, but more kept coming, claws, wings, snapping jaws. "You can't stop it," the Scribe said, stepping closer, his voice calm over the chaos. "The ink's already running. The city's waking up." She glanced at the mural. The black river was spreading, seeping into the pavement, tendrils of it snaking toward the street. She could feel it, a pulse, deep and alive, like the heartbeat of something massive stirring beneath Chicago. The Scribe wasn't lying. Whatever he'd started, it was bigger than him, bigger than her. Nora rolled under a swipe from a tattooed claw and came up behind him, soaked and gasping. She didn't aim for his body this time. She went for the mural. The knife sank into the wall, splitting the painted river in two. A sound like a scream tore through the alley, high and keening, and the Scribe faltered, clutching his chest as if she'd stabbed him instead. "No!" he roared, spinning toward her, his tattoos flaring brighter. But the mural was crumbling, paint flaking away in chunks, taking his wolves and hands with it. The black tendrils in the street hissed and retreated, sinking back into the cracks. The Scribe's form flickered, his tattoos fading, until he was just a shadow that dissolved into the rain, leaving behind a faint echo of his rage. Nora yanked the knife free, chest heaving. The wall was bare now, just weathered brick, the mural gone. The city's pulse faded, though she knew it wasn't gone for good, just sleeping again, restless and waiting. She sheathed the knife and lit another cigarette, her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline ebbed. Her phone buzzed again, louder this time. She fished it out, saw Lena's name, and answered. "Nora, where the hell are you?" Her sister's voice crackled through, sharp with worry. "You said you'd be here hours ago." "Yeah, I know," Nora said, exhaling smoke into the damp night. "Got held up. I'll be there soon." "You always say that. What's going on?" "Just work. I'll explain later." Lena sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "You better. I'm holding you to it." Nora hung up and started walking. The rain was letting up, the clouds thinning to reveal a sliver of moon. The city felt different now, restless, like it was watching her back. She'd stopped the Scribe, for tonight at least. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he'd be back, and next time, the ink might run deeper. Chapter 2. The Shop on Halsted. Nora didn't head straight to Lena's. Dinner could wait, she needed answers, and family wasn't the place to find them. She turned south instead, cutting through the drizzle-soaked streets toward Halsted, her boots splashing in shallow puddles. The city hummed around her, car horns blaring, the distant rumble of the L train, the chatter of late-night bar hoppers spilling out onto the sidewalks. To them, Chicago was just a place, a grid of streets and lights. To Nora, it was a battlefield, its scars hidden beneath the surface. She stopped in front of a narrow storefront wedged between a pawn shop and a laundromat, its windows cluttered with faded trinkets and yellowed posters. The sign above the door read Tomosh's Oddities, in peeling gold letters, the paint chipped and curling. Most people thought it was a junk shop, a dusty hole in the wall full of overpriced kitsch, old radios, porcelain dolls with cracked faces, taxidermied birds frozen mid-flight. They weren't entirely wrong, but Tomosh dealt in more than nostalgia. He dealt in secrets. The bell above the door jangled as she stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of sandalwood incense and aging paper. Shelves towered to the ceiling, crammed with oddities. Jars of cloudy liquid labeled in Polish, a rusted astrolabe, a stuffed bat with glass eyes that seemed to follow her. Behind the counter, Tomosh looked up from a ledger, his wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose. He was in his 60s, wiry and sharp-eyed, with a mop of grey hair that stuck out like he'd been electrocuted. A cigarette dangled from his lips, unlit, a habit he'd never kicked even after quitting. "Nora," he said, closing the ledger with a soft thud. "You look like hell warmed over." "Thanks," she said, brushing wet hair out of her face. Her jacket dripped onto the floor, leaving a small puddle. "You got anything stronger than that shitty tea you keep back there?" He smirked, the lines around his eyes deepening, and pulled a bottle of bourbon from under the counter. He poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid glinting in the dim light of a flickering lamp. "Rough night. Wolves made of paint tried to eat me in an alley," she said, taking the glass he slid her way. Then some tattooed freak calling himself the Scribe showed up, talking about waking the city. "Nearly broke my arm before I took out his mural. You tell me." Tamosh's smirk faded, the cigarette dropping to the counter. He took a long sip of his bourbon, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "The Scribe. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. You know him?" Nora leaned forward, resting her elbows on the counter, the glass cool against her palm. "Not personally. Old stories, whispers from the ink workers, folks who bind magic into drawings, tattoos, words. He's a myth, or he's supposed to be. Been around since the city was just mud and tents, if you believe the tales. They say he wrote things into being, creatures, curses, whole pieces of Chicago's shadow side. Most think he's dead, or never existed at all." "He's real enough," Nora said, downing half a bourbon in one swallow. It burned going down, grounding her. "And he's tearing holes in whatever keeps this place stable. I've been cleaning up his messes for months. Rats in the sewers chattering like old men, crows in Pilsen screaming names, now these wolves. What's he after?" Tamosh rubbed his chin, his fingers rasping against stubble. "If it's him, he's not just stirring trouble for kicks. The city's got layers, Nora. You know that better than most. Under the streets, there's old magic, stuff from before the Great Fire, before the settlers even put down roots. Native stories talk about spirits bound into the land, locked away when the city rose. It's sealed tight, or it's supposed to be. Sounds like he's trying to break it open." "Why?" She set the glass down, her scarred hand flexing absently. "Power, maybe. Revenge. Or he's just gone mad after all these years. Hard to say with something that old." Tamosh reached under the counter again, this time pulling out a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was stained and cracked, the leather peeling at the edges, the pages yellowed and brittle. He slid it toward her. "Found this a few weeks back at an estate sale in Bridgeport. Mentions a scribe who bound something big under the city, tied it to a network of seals. If he's undoing that work now, you're not just fighting him, you're fighting what he locked away." Nora took the book, flipping it open. The text was a jumbled mix of English and something older, Latin, maybe, or a dialect she didn't recognize, scribbled notes and diagrams filling the margins. One page showed a rough map of Chicago's streets, overlaid with strange symbols. An eye, a spiral, a clawed hand. Seals. Like physical things? Could be. Could be buildings, objects, even people marked with his ink. "Look for patterns in where these leaks are happening. That's your map." He tapped the book with a bony finger. "Start there." She nodded, pocketing it. The weight of it against her hip felt like a promise, or a threat. "Thanks, Tamosh. I owe you." "You always owe me," he said with a dry laugh, picking up his cigarette and rolling it between his fingers. "Try not to die out there, yeah? I'd hate to lose my best customer." "No promises," she said, finishing her bourbon. The warmth lingered as she headed back into the night. Outside, the drizzle had turned to mist, cloaking the streetlights in halos. She pulled out the book again, flipping to the map under the faint glow of a neon sign. The leaks she'd tracked, rats near the river, crows in Pilsen, wolves on Division, formed a rough arc, curving toward the loop. If Tamosh was right, the seals were scattered across the city, and the scribe was hitting them one by one. She needed to find the next before he did. Her phone buzzed again. She ignored it, but it kept going, insistent. With a curse, she answered. "Nora, seriously," Lena's voice snapped through. "Where are you? You said soon an hour ago." "I'm working," Nora said, tucking the book away. "Something came up. Something always comes up. Mom's worried, I'm worried. What's going on with you?" "It's complicated, Lena. I'll be there when I can." "Fine. But you're explaining this time. No more dodging." Lena hung up, leaving Nora with the dial tone and a twinge of guilt. She shoved the phone back in her pocket and started walking. The scribe wasn't waiting, and neither could she. Chapter 3. The Sister and the Shadow. Lena's apartment was in Logan Square, A third-floor walk-up with creaky stairs and a view of the L tracks rattling past. Nora let herself in with the spare key, the smell of roasted chicken and garlic hitting her as she stepped inside, a stark contrast to the damp rot of the streets. Lena was in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun. She was 3 years younger than Nora, softer around the edges, with none of the scars or hard lines that came with Nora's life. A social worker by day, she had a knack for seeing the good in people. Except, lately, when it came to her sister. "You're late," Lena said without turning around, her voice tight. "And you smell like a bar. And paint." "Rough night," Nora said, dropping her jacket over a chair. The ink stains on it stood out like bruises against the leather. She flexed her arm, wincing as the claw marks throbbed. "Work stuff, right?" Lena set a plate of chicken and mashed potatoes in front of her, the clink of ceramic loud in the small space. She sat across the table, arms crossed, her brown eyes searching Nora's face. "You still pretending you're a PI or something? Because last I checked, private investigators don't come home covered in black gunk and bleeding." Nora glanced at her sleeve, then her arm, where blood had soaked through the torn fabric. "It's complicated. It's always complicated with you." Lena's tone softened, but her frown deepened. "Mom keeps asking why you don't call." "I don't know what to tell her anymore." "Nora's fine, just busy?" "That's wearing thin." "Tell her I'm okay," Nora said, poking at the food with her fork. Her stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the fight, the scribe's words still rattling in her head. "Just tied up with stuff." "Stuff?" Lena snorted, leaning back. "You never talk about it. You just show up looking like you've been in a bar fight, eat my food, then vanish again. What's going on, Nora? For real?" Nora sighed, rubbing her scar absently. It itched in the warmth of the apartment, a reminder of the night she'd stopped pretending the world was normal. "It's better if you don't know, Lena. Trust me." "Trust you?" Lena's voice rose, sharp with frustration. "You're my sister, not some stranger. I deserve more than that." Before Nora could answer, a shadow moved across the window, a dark, fluid shape sliding over the glass like spilled ink. Her head snapped up, hand dropping to the knife at her belt. She was on her feet in an instant, the chair scraping back. "What the hell, Nora?" Lena said, standing too, her eyes wide. "What's?" "Stay back," Nora snapped, edging toward the window. The shadow stretched, tendrils curling inward, then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She yanked the curtains aside, peering out. The street below was empty, rain-slicked and silent, the L tracks glinting under the streetlights. "You're freaking me out," Lena said, her voice trembling now. "What was that?" "Nothing," Nora lied, sheathing the knife. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "Just the light." "Don't bullshit me," Lena said, stepping closer. "That wasn't light. You saw something, and you've got a knife. What's going on?" Nora turned, meeting her sister's gaze. Lena's face was pale, her hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Nora wanted to tell her about the mural, the scribe, the things that crawled out of the city's shadows. But the words stuck in her throat. Knowing wouldn't keep Lena safe. It'd pull her in deeper. "I can't stay," Nora said, grabbing her jacket. "I've got to go." "Nora, wait." Lena reached for her, but Nora was already at the door. "I'll call you," she said, stepping into the hall. "Promise." She didn't look back as she descended the stairs, the sound of Lena's frustrated shout muffled by the closing door. Outside, the mist had thickened, cloaking the street in grey. The shadow wasn't random. The scribe was watching her, or something tied to him was. She couldn't stay near Lena, couldn't risk dragging her into this. Not yet. Chapter 4. The Map and the Monster. Back on the streets, Nora pulled out Tamosha's book and a crumpled map of Chicago she kept in her pocket. She marked the leaks she'd encountered. Rats near the river, crows in Pilsen, wolves on Division, her pen leaving faint dots on the worn paper. They didn't form a perfect pattern, but there was a rough circle, arcing toward the loop, the city's pulsing core. If the seals were real, one had to be close, and she needed to find it before the scribe did. She headed downtown, the mist swirling around her as she crossed into the loop. Skyscrapers loomed like sentinels over the river, their lights blurred in the haze. She stopped at a corner near the Art Institute, where a bronze lion statue guarded the steps, its patina streaked with rain. Something about it felt off. The air around it shimmered faintly, a ripple like heat rising off pavement in summer. She approached, running her hand over the lion's flank. The metal was warm despite the cold, and the runes on her knife hummed louder, a lobe as she felt in her teeth. She traced her fingers along the statue's base and found a carving. An eye, etched so faintly it blended with the bronze's texture. A seal. She pressed her palm against it, and the shimmer intensified, the air growing heavy. Before she could investigate further, the ground trembled, a low rumble that shook the pavement. People nearby yelped, clutching bags and umbrellas, assuming it was a train passing underground. Nora knew better. The pavement cracked, a jagged line splitting the street, and a shape erupted from it. A creature of ink and stone, humanoid but twisted, with arms like gnarled tree branches and a face that was all jagged teeth, no eyes. It roared, a sound that rattled her bones and shattered a nearby car window, and swung a massive fist at her. She dove aside, the blow shattering the sidewalk where she'd stood, sending chunks of concrete flying. Pedestrians screamed and scattered, their shouts swallowed by the chaos as Nora scrambled up, knife ready. The thing lumbered toward her, shedding chunks of stone that melted into ink as they hit the ground, the smell sharp and acrid. She darted in, slashing at its leg. The blade bit deep, carving through stone like clay, and it howled, black liquid gushing from the wound. It swung again, faster this time, and she barely ducked, the wind of it ruffling her hair. "Nice try," she muttered, circling it. But it wasn't alone. More cracks split the street, smaller shapes clawing free, their bodies a mix of ink and gravel, snapping jaws and clawed hands. She was outnumbered, and the seal was still active, pulsing behind her. A shout cut through the chaos. "Nora, duck!" She dropped flat as a bolt of blue light streaked overhead, slamming into the monster's chest. It staggered, giving her a second to glance back. A figure stood on the museum steps, short, wiry, with a shock of red hair and a glowing tattoo on her forearm that pulsed with energy. Riley Voss, another hunter Nora had crossed paths with before. They weren't friends, exactly. Riley was too cocky, too reckless, but they'd saved each other's asses enough times to call it something. "Thought you could use a hand," Riley said, grinning as she fired another bolt from her tattoo, the ink on her arm shifting like a living thing. "What's this one?" "Seal Guardian, I think," Nora said, rolling to her feet. The smaller creatures lunged, and she slashed one apart, ink splattering her boots. "Help me take it down." Riley nodded, and they fell into a rhythm. Nora with her knife, carving through the smaller ones, Riley with her ink magic, blasting the big one with bursts of light. The monster roared, swinging wildly, but they dodged and struck, wearing it down. Nora ducked under an arm and drove her blade into its skull, the runes flaring as it sank in. The creature shuddered, then collapsed into a puddle of ink and rubble, the smaller ones dissolving with it. Panting, Nora turned to the lion. "We need to break this." Riley stepped up, tracing her tattoo with a finger. It glowed brighter, and she aimed a pulse of energy at the statue. The eye carving shattered with a sharp crack, bronze fragments raining down, and the air stilled, the shimmer fading. "One down," Riley said, wiping sweat from her brow. "How many more?" "No idea," Nora admitted, sheathing her knife. "But the scribe's behind it. He's waking something big." Riley whistled, holstering her grin. "You don't do small problems, do you?" "Never have," Nora said, glancing at the map. The circle was tightening. "Come on. We've got more to find." Chapter 5, The River's Edge. They tracked the next leak to the Chicago River, where the water ran blacker than it should have, even under the city's lights. Nora and Riley stood on the bank near Wacker Drive, the mist curling off the surface like smoke. The book pointed to a bridge piling, a concrete pillar jutting from the water, its base etched with a faint spiral, another seal. The air here was thick, heavy with a pressure Nora couldn't name, like the city was holding its breath. "He's systematic," Riley said, studying the map over Nora's shoulder. "Hitting these in order. What's under the city that's worth all this?" "Something old," Nora said, folding the map. "Tomosh thinks it's pre-fire, maybe older. The scribe called it a cage, said the city's built on it, keeping it locked." Riley raised an eyebrow. "A cage for what?" "No clue. But if he's breaking it open, we're running out of time to find out." The river churned, waves lapping against the piling, and the scribe emerged, taller than before, his tattoos blazing across his skin like wildfire. His eyes burned white, and his voice boomed over the water. "You're too late, Nora Kane. The seals are breaking. The ink flows." He raised a hand, and the river erupted, tattooed beasts surging forth. Dragons with snapping jaws, wolves with amber eyes, things with too many limbs and too many teeth. Nora and Riley fought back to back, her knife flashing, Riley's magic flaring. A dragon lunged, and Nora slashed its throat, ink spraying her face. Riley blasted a wolf apart, its howl cut short. The creatures kept coming, relentless, and the scribe watched, his smile sharp. Nora ducked a claw and charged him, knife aimed for his chest. He caught her arm, lifting her off the ground, his grip searing her skin through her sleeve. "You can't stop what's written," he said, his voice a hiss inside her skull. She spat in his face, the ink on her lips mixing with saliva, and drove the knife into his arm. He roared, dropping her, and Riley hit him with a blast of light that sent him staggering into the water. The seal on the piling cracked under the pressure, a sharp snap echoing over the river, and the surface calmed, the creatures dissolving. "He's not dead," Riley said, helping Nora up. Her arm was bruised, her jacket torn worse than before. "No," Nora agreed, wiping ink from her face. "But he's pissed. That's something." They retreated from the bank, the city's lights flickering overhead. 2 seals down, but the scribe was stronger here, tied to the river's flow. Nora's arm ached, and doubt gnawed at her. Could they stop him before the cage broke wide open? Chapter 6. The heart of the cage. The final seal was under the city, in the tunnels beneath the loop. Nora and Riley descended through a maintenance hatch off LaSalle Street, the air growing cold and thick as they dropped into the dark. Flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing walls lined with faded runes, their edges pulsing faintly with a sickly green glow. The tunnels smelled of mold and rust, the sound of dripping water echoing around them. They followed the map to a chamber, a cavernous space carved from stone, its ceiling lost in shadow. At the center was a massive slab, 20 feet across, etched with a map of Chicago, its streets traced in grooves that bled ink, pooling in the cracks. The runes here were brighter, angrier, and the air thrummed with power. The scribe was waiting, his form fraying at the edges, tattoos swirling chaotically across his skin. "You're too late," he said, his voice a chorus of whispers. "The cage is open." The slab cracked, a deafening sound that shook the chamber, and the ground split as something rose. A colossus of ink and bone, 30 feet tall, its body a mass of jagged edges and writhing tendrils. Its eyes glowed red, twin furnaces in a skull-like face, and its roar was the sound of a city breaking. It was the heart of the cage, bound for centuries, now free. Nora and Riley fought, dodging its massive fists as they slammed into the stone, sending shards flying. Nora slashed at its legs, the knife biting shallow cuts. Riley blasted it with magic, the light scorching its hide. It barely flinched, its tendrils lashing out, one catching Riley and hurling her against the wall. She hit hard, groaning, and Nora cursed, diving to shield her. The scribe laughed, his tattoos feeding the colossus, streams of ink flowing from him to it. Nora realized the truth, he was its anchor. She lunged at him, dodging a tendril, and drove her knife into his chest. The runes flared, and he screamed, his form unraveling, tattoos bursting apart in a flood of black. The colossus faltered, its roar fading, and collapsed into a tidal wave of ink that drained into the cracks, leaving silence. The chamber stilled, the slab inert. The seals were gone, the cage empty, for now. "Think that's it?" Riley asked, staggering up, blood trickling from her temple. "For tonight," Nora said, sheathing her knife. "Let's get out of here." They climbed back to the surface, emerging into a quiet city. The rain had started again, soft and steady. Nora lit a cigarette, the flame steady despite her trembling hands. She'd won, but the scars, hers and the city's, lingered. Chicago was safe, but it was awake, and she'd be there when it stirred again.